Hello, I'm John Fenn, and I'm a staff member at the American Folklife Center. And today I'm here in the Coolidge Auditorium with members of the Jones Benally Family Dancers, including Jones Benally, Jeneda Benally, and Clayson Benally. And they just performed a beautiful set of Navajo dances and songs, and I want to thank you so much for coming to the Library of Congress and sharing with us. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about the traditions that you were sharing. I would love to hear about Jones' entry into the tradition, when you started learning to dance and sing, and who you learned from.
I learned with my mother, my father, my grandfather, my uncle, they're all traditional way. I grew up with them. That time, just like you go to school, young people, they had to be forced to learn the ceremony, nothing to hide. You had to learn everything to grow up, because that time, no, far away to hospital, or grocery store, or nothing, because they teach you the whole things and then, but you never know. Later on, you had a family, so you grow up with them. Just like they educate you, not the English way, their way, Then ceremony, different ceremony, people get sick. You don't have to go to hospital. You get medicine yourself to heal up yourself. Or if you don't know, you go another medicine man to help you. So you have to work together, So everything.
And was there a certain age at which you were ready to perform a ceremony?
Well, when I was a kid, like I say, I was a kid, I would and work with that then, do sand paintings, and learn everything. That time, the people forcing. Now the people is different ways and often different kind of religions, so they're all divided. So that one, the people, traditional people, more people, in to carry on, they work together. And now it's all splitting away, but it's more important what you are, because my mother put me this world. So the grassroots, she had to teach you how to stand up on 2 feet. You don't let anybody, be strong. And then you learn for protection. If it's something that, even if you come in medicine, man, you learn something protects you. That way, somebody try to get you, it doesn't work. So there's a lot of things you have to learn. So you have to set the ceremony to find out what can be done. So that way, and communicate with everything on this world. So that's what you have to learn. I go to school, but I didn't learn anything. But just say how to, to talk the English, But and then I go to the people, what they believe, just like shopping, see which one it could be. The people talk to me, say, come on, you're going to read the Bible, they could be reborn against it. But then I find out myself. But I learned first. But here they was telling about. But my mother put in this world, and my father. If I go to something on the paper, it doesn't. So makeup. Then I think it's going to make fun of them, my relatives. So I was more respect. There was the one who put me on this world. And then open myself on this world, and everything is what they contact me, how to live on this world. So that's why then I teach my kids the same way. So when I get sick, they help me and get well. I could have the open side surgery, but I go to them and fix up. So we're working together, just like that's why, well, you know, like you go to school and then just learn to technology. There'll be something else, not for yourself.
Have you taught people other than your own children and brought them into the tradition?
A lot, yeah. A lot of people ask me like this, and they learn. And some of my relatives that I teach them, and then because our life is easy to go with the wind, you know, because if you don't learn nothing but you go with the wind, you know, because then you got to learn how to live on this world. Was they can sell you anything that you get the brainwash. So here you are in the middle of nowhere, and then you might go the other way or go the other way, you know. So you here sometimes forget yourself. And then most important, who you are. So that's what the cultures, that what we carry on.
Now, we learned a little bit about the hoop dance when you performed on stage.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you've been doing hoop dance since you were very small.
Yeah, I do. I grew up and learned sand paintings and all that, and because I have my grandfather, my uncles, my mother, they were medicine person.
Okay.
So they, just like hospital, a lot of people come out, we help them. So I was helping all the time. I grew up since I was a kid. And then the ceremony, some of the ceremony dance, you know, different dance like hoop dance, the ceremony, they're not the dance. They make something small for a special prayer. They're often the nature, a certain way, how you work with everything.
And when you're learning to do something like the hoop dance, as you mentioned during the performance, in a ceremonial setting, the hoops are used once for that particular patient. Do you learn how to make the hoops as well?
Yeah, all different sizes, all different kinds of ceremony, because not only one ceremony, they represent a certain way, release what your body in, because like I say, your hair blown away, and then you pick it up and put it back on. Later on you have a problem, you don't know why. Because everything is the same, it's like air, we breathe in. There's the one throw away your head, and once you throw away, it's not yours. Then like you buy in bad. If you don't, then you have somebody against you, but you don't know.
And so when someone calls upon you, because they don't know what's wrong, you have to go.
For anybody, even you blow away, later on you have problems. Then
I know if my hat falls off, I have a lot of problems.
Right.
So there are many ceremonies. What my dad is referring to is like the wind, for example. So if somebody's affected by the wind, you know, the first step maybe might be going to see somebody that would diagnose, and then if they would identify, oh, you are affected by this process, maybe, you know, tornado, hurricane, dust devil, those have a certain power and can affect us in different ways. So if it's a part of that person's body, how do you release that? So the first step would be, okay, we're going to identify the root cause, where it began, and then from there, what can be done. There's not just one type of wind wave ceremony. There's a few different options and many different practitioners. So there would be almost like a council, you know, everybody would work together.
Okay.
So-and-so might know this ceremony, they can help you with this, but maybe they'd come to a diagnostician who would, you know, use maybe crystal or hand trembling or different methods to establish this is the problem now from here, maybe this ceremony, and if, you know, there might be a whole list of things that, you know, as you get older, the way we carry ourselves on this earth, you know, everything from darkness to the earth, you know, they can have impacts on our life and how to live a long, full life, you know, to walk in beauty, as we say, with all those things within our natural world. to have a beautiful life. You know, there's very particular ways to carry ourselves.
And so this gets to an interesting point about learning the tradition. So Jones mentioned you both. He started teaching you when you were young. Has he been your only teacher? It sounds like you had many teachers who were uncles and grandfathers. But you and I were talking just the other day about how there's not a constriction, but fewer people doing some of these traditions. So what was your experience growing up and learning?
I've had another teacher as well, and you know, for different specialized ceremonies, you have to become initiated as well. So for each ceremony that we take part in, like the fire dance, we have to be initiated into the fire dance in order to perform the dance for the patient. And when you're dancing, you become the healer. So after you dance, then you serve the medicine to the patient. And so you know, when in that whole process, you're being educated as well. You're learning from the lead medicine practitioners, whether it's somebody who's related or not related. But it's what it is finding people as well who want to teach. And I think that's kind of difficult, is because with a lot of our traditional medicine people, they wonder if the newer generations are really interested in learning. Is it something that they're going to carry forward, or is it something that's just part-time? Because there's no such thing as being a part-time healer. When you're initiated and when you do this medicinal work, and it's our traditional sciences, and I think a lot of people don't understand that you spend your whole lifetime learning. There's no end to learning with all of the different ceremonies, the prayers, the way of utilizing herbs, whether or not you use a plant in hot water or cold water. It varies so much that, you know, it's a lifelong commitment to our traditional sciences and carrying it on. So finding our practitioners sometimes is a little bit more difficult, and there aren't very many left.
Out of our tribe, I think there's maybe 300,000 Jeneda Navajo enrolled citizens, and I know I've heard some statistics say that maybe 10% or less are traditional, practicing Hajoncha, the blessing way, and, you know, carrying on this lifestyle. But for myself, I know when I was a young child, I'd go with my dad to help out at ceremonies, and I would, you know, for my dad, his process, you know, he was chosen. It wasn't just, you know, he's got 9 brothers, they didn't all learn, but they identified and recognized that my dad had certain abilities, so he studied, he learned. And for myself, when I was young, you know, I'd go there with my dad, and we moved off the reservation because there's very little economy, and my dad had to find work, and Navajo was my first language. I was fluent. Then we moved off the reservation, lost a lot of that going into the school process. Still kind of, you know, we talk about the boarding school era. My dad was fortunate to miss that. He was in his 20s. You know, his mom hid him out, kept him safe. So he had the traditional education system. And then when I was born, we were living off the reservation and putting classes to remove accent, to discourage language. You know, Navajo was still kind of forbidden. You were, you know, it was shameful to be Native American. So in that process, I lost a lot of my language, but when I go to the reservation to help my dad at these 9-night healing ceremonies, there was one, you know, quite a few medicine practitioners that identified me. They said, "You're gonna learn." You know, they were like, "Okay, you're gonna come live with me." And in retrospect, you know, I wish I would have taken that time, but with the American education system, you know, a lot of our ceremonies are during the winter, and you have to be there practicing full time. You know, it's a lifelong dedication. You know, it's like going to get your master's degree and maybe even your doctorate, you know, full lifetime of studying. And each ceremony has different subcategories. So you might have the lightning ceremony. One of my uncles, his name was Nevi Jensen. My dad used to go and help him, and I was a young child, you know, just a young man. And he said, "You're going to learn. I teach you." And sadly, he passed, you know, and didn't have any apprentices. And I was in that process of just starting to build the courage to learn. And I was helping. I'd go out. You know, he'd show up. If my dad wasn't there, he'd say, "Come on, let's go. Get in and go help him and his wife," and just remote way out in Gray Mountain area. And it was a lot of work, you know, not one practitioner. You know, there's a lot of techniques and methods for that ceremony, and it takes a lot of knowledge, you know, when to collect herbs or plants and medicine, and how to prepare everything for that patient. And if it's just the medicine practitioner, it's very difficult to, you know, if you're doing a large sand painting, there's a lot of knowledge, even the placement of the stars, of everything, it has to be exact. It's an oral tradition that, you know, they say goes back to the beginning of time, and it's not supposed to be altered, no changes. The way you hear it from your grandmothers and grandfathers, you know, they'll tell you this history over and over, but if something changes or is altered, then, you know, you're supposed to repair it, you know, you're not supposed to use it.
Okay.
Otherwise, it, you know, changes it and alters and loses, you know, its power, its quality. So everything had to be exact and just perfect. And that process that my dad went through to learn, you know, he was fortunate because it wasn't broken, you know, but for many generations now, we've had boarding school kind of mentality where it's still taboo, you know, to talk about some of these subjects, you know, our traditional ways are sometimes still frowned down upon, and people don't support it or acknowledge it, you know, in the way that it should be respected.
Like, just such a disconnect, you know, and we're really fortunate with my father because, you know, his first education was our Diné way, that our traditional medicinal sciences, that was his first education. And so during the time when he was learning all of our traditional ways, a lot of his peers were sent off to boarding school. So it created this whole generation of disconnect, of people not understanding who we are as Diné people, not understanding why our culture, why there are cultural aspects that are supposed to be done in particular ways. And it became, and I think it still is today, there's a lot of like, yee, a lot of, it's an expression that, yeah, that, you know,
it's
like,
scary.
No way, it's scary, leave it alone, because they don't know how to ask, and it's kind of reinstituting amongst our people really our core values of listening, of planning, of understanding, of teaching, and of having hope into our future, and all of these values that I think were undone by the boarding school era. I think that we as Diné people are in the process, as messy as it is, we're in the process of relearning that kind of core foundational aspect of who we are.
And I think we see that with your children in particular, who did join you on stage and who are learning from their grandfather, from their mother, and I imagine from other people who are involved.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely, it's so important, you know. And you know, one thing that I find is that our younger generations are so curious, and they're so hungry to know who they are, and it's difficult because there aren't as many people to teach, and you know, we're blessed that we have our father, you know, to continue that legacy of that knowledge, to pass it down. But you know, one thing that's really important is for our youth to be able to ask questions. Why is it like this? What does this symbol mean? Why is his warrior's cap different than his warrior's cap? Learning and asking for, I think, all of us as Indigenous peoples to understand more about our cultures, who we are, who is it that we are truly, that our ancestors were, but that have brought us to this point.
It's also important to acknowledge that this is an oral
Yeah, I
culture,
was going to
that
point that out.
this is something that's not supposed to be written, filmed, or videoed. So when somebody studies or learns something that's ceremonial, it's sacred, and the context, usually if the ceremony is being performed, that's the time to learn. And
Right.
so it's not like there's a school or a class and somebody sits down,
Listens.
can have a conversation and talk about it, but to understand the full history, might have to be in the winter time, and at a specific moment during that ceremony, that's when you'll hear, this is what this means and the purpose and why it's done this way. But there's so many techniques and aspects that not one person knows all of these ceremonies. There's so many, different ceremonies that exist, and every time my dad sits down with some of our elders and asks other practitioners, I get to be a fly on the wall and hear, and a lot of these practitioners, they haven't taught, that hasn't connected to any of their family members. A lot of that knowledge, when somebody passes, it's gone. That's it. Severance of so much beautiful wisdom. I remember when I was a young man, there's the eagle dance that we shared here. They call it Yowe Hatra, the bead ceremony. And I think there might be one practitioner that exists that still carries this on. And it relates to other Pueblo tribes. There's the eagle dance, and there's shared history that is common amongst the Hopi and some other tribes. So you might hear and recognize some of the same songs, because the story for our people talks about a young child that, for some reason he was abandoned, and this owl found and identified this child and protected him, and then they eventually brought him and they raised this young boy, and then later he traveled to find his people when he became of age. There's a long, beautiful history. We'd be here for quite some time talking about it, but that journey that this child goes on and eventually, goes with the eagles and learns their ceremonies and brings that back to our people to help, if they're affected by the eagle or there's certain particular things. But when my dad was young, he would go with one of his grandfathers. They would fast, they would prepare, and they would go and collect eagle feathers. They would prepare and they would sing, and my dad would explain it. You'd see a small dot in the sky. All of a sudden you'd see it get bigger and bigger, and pretty soon an eagle would land right in front of you. This is what he used to do. They call the eagles, sing to it, it would land. One of his grandfathers would know, they'd communicate which feather was loose, and they would take only whatever feather was needed, that bird was ready to release. And then they'd tie a string with turquoise around it, and then send off that eagle, sing. And if that same eagle returned, it's already marked with the turquoise, and they would collect however many feathers. Sometimes there was an eagle that was at its full life and was ready to pass, so it'd offer its life, and take the eagle. That was the only time that it was permissible to kill or take the life of an eagle, as if it offered you its life. And then after the feathers were collected, then that's when the Yowe Hatra, the bead ceremony, would be performed, to release that spirit that that person would be affected by from that eagle. So very particular, but today I don't know of anybody that practices it really in that full regard. Most people will go to game and fish to get their eagle feathers, but like this, there's a feather here this one would have been collected in this way. This is several hundreds of years old.
Okay.
This is what
Mine
was
as
carried
well.
on. And I didn't believe it myself until I was reading. There was a Spanish dictionary, missionaries, when they came into our region, they were particularly, their mission was to convert. So they learned the language for the purpose of conversion. But they identified, a lot of the ceremonies, and they talk about the bead ceremony, the eagle ceremony, and they talk about how the medicine practitioner would sing and call the eagle, and then tie the turquoise. And I didn't believe it until I read the little clip note in this Spanish
Which
Navajo
you should
dictionary.
always believe what your dad says before a
Isn't
book.
that the first thing you learn?
But nobody carries that on anymore
Yeah.
because you go to Game and Fish and you can acquire eagle feathers that way today.
Which leads to a question I had. Many times during your performance, you mentioned that these dances are modified to perform on stage. You're not performing the dance that will be done in the ceremony. And I think that's important to recognize, and also leads to something you had just said, Jeneda, which is making people aware of what the culture is and what the cultural heritage is. So sharing the culture on stage is one facet, whereas continuing on the traditions in a ceremonial, way, in a sacred way, is another facet of cultural preservation. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the modification of the dances in order to perform them and share them with communities and audiences outside of a ceremonial context. What do you take into consideration when you say you're going to perform an eagle dance or a bead ceremony on stage?
We're not performing the ceremony
Yeah, the
on
dance.
stage, sharing the dance. And a lot of, even in the ceremonial context, like the feather dance, that one is on the 9th night, the holy night, and it's kind of a social interaction where all the community comes out, the family, everybody is there. There's a fire, and it starts in the evening, maybe around 10 or 11 at night, and many different ceremonial practitioners come, they bring their ceremony, and when they offer that dance, it's a social context, where everybody comes together. But the nature of the dance is ceremonial. But for my father, was identifying, one of his grandfathers, was, he had to get permission and ask, and there was specific intent, a recognition that our culture is being lost, and that one day most of our people might not even know or recognize what this is or what this means. So there was, permission that was granted, and, saying we need to preserve this. This is something that needs to be done. The ceremony is different. That's only specific, that's reserved for at home for our people. But when you share this, let people know that we're still here. This is what we carry on. And hopefully one day that our future generations, that they'll see and recognize this as their own too.
Okay.
We also go into schools as well back home to teach our dances and to teach about, our outfits, what it is that we're wearing. And many years ago, I remember growing up, and a lot of the men used to think that the traditional men's dress was cloth pants.
Capris, Spanish style.
With, white pants and, and the velvet and a bandana, and kept saying, no, go before then. And this is when we decided, because we used to share intertribal dances before, and we decided at that point that our own people don't know who they're supposed to be, what our traditional dress is, what all the symbolism. They don't know what this is. So we decided that we would only do our Diné dances because it was more important to bring it back to our people. And now, actually, people would come up to us, our own Diné people would come up, and they'd say, what tribe are you? They'd look at, our warriors' caps and say, what tribe are you? I'd say, we're Jeneda. This is who you are. And now, it took about 2 decades to reintroduce the warrior's cap back to our people. And now people wear their caps proudly, but still a lot of people don't know the meaning behind it. And they think that you can just put a warrior's cap on, but they don't understand that each warrior's cap shows what societies you belong to. Okay. That not everybody can wear one. And so it's really this reintroduction as well to our own people, even with the songs, the dances, the social dances, a lot of dances that people haven't seen because they didn't grow up with it. And it's not their fault. The boarding school era really robbed us of our cultures. And so it's reintroducing these really important aspects of our culture that have kept our peoples alive for so long. It used to be that our people lived to be over 100 years old. That was very normal. It's very, normal that my dad is 90 years old and he can do the hoop dance, but it's extraordinary for other cultures to see because the life expectancy for these other cultures who don't have our traditional ceremonies, who don't have our traditional foods, who don't have that close connection with and the accessibility to our traditional sciences, they don't have that. So it's for us, it was very typical.
Now I see that you brought a basket. And one of the first dances you did today was a basket dance. And you told us a little bit about the baskets, but I would love to hear, connected to what you were just saying, about how a basket, which is a utilitarian item that has been used historically, how that connects to the dance and to the social components and the sharing of culture. So could you tell us a little bit about the basket?
He wants to know if you can talk a little bit about the basket.
Well, it's a long story about the first, right in the center, is Secret Mountain, 4 Mountain is Secret. The Creator make us right in the center. After the Creator, that time was earth small, before the Grand Canyon. It was small. In that time, there was the Creator to make us, there are a lot of them. They're still with us. So that time, the spider woman was shown to the people to learn this, so they follow that. The other one is when the lady, when they get mad, they turn out the bear, because they call the bear woman. So he made the basket too, but they come clockwise, the weaving from inside. So then later on, there was something that happened, and then the medicine men tried to open like earthquakes and tornado, hurricanes, just like here the bad wind and stuff like that, and even the storm was running around and killed the people. So how going to stop? They trying to use for up and something that, but it doesn't work. So they make this, so then they set the ceremony, why it doesn't work. And because they think it was good. When they use it, when they ceremony, the Creator make us, they use the basket that was belong to the spiders and the bear woman. So, and then they set the ceremony, said, this is not, human is said to be a different basket. That's why the offering doesn't work nothing. So they said, why is that? the sun is, I thought the sun is go around the earth, but it's not. The earth was turning. So they weave in the same way, the opposite, the clockwise. So that's why when you go in from here, you go in, see the other one is backward.
Okay.
So when you in, this would always open. Come in here, you go back, go in the center. When the ceremony, we come back, go away, we don't like sick people. Now we use it that way. So that's how they make it. And they make this one. And a lot of story here. And then they use it for the often all the tornado, hurricane, and flood, and earthquake. And they pray to them because when you come in medicine, anything is you contact.
Okay.
You contact the earth, the moon, the stars, and everything's in the word. So that's what all in here. And so that's what then they offer in the work. And everything was peaceful. They changed. Because the whole story had never ended, can tell about a lot of stories. So the second Martin, when they discovered the people there, the Creator says, how are we going to protect our kids? So they set the dirt in the four directions. It'll grow. And then it'll go, and then they had the sun, the go-away ceremony, sing all night. So the sun in the second mountain, it'll grow. So that's they will learn the Lord versus we educate from them. So that's what we care on. So that's why always open here. This is at the mountain.
Okay.
So right in the center, they put the rainbow around for secret mountain. Now the people, they have a problem. So that time, after we're not disturbing the earth. One of those days, they digging too much, it would be out of control. So that's certainly arts they separate like this. All the earth is separate too, and they come in, and then if we're mistake, be out of control.
He's talking about a lot of the teachings
So
that
that's
we have.
what they make it. We breathe too.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So all of them, we all have the same. Our life is the same exactly. No different who we are. So they're right here in the center. So that's a big eruption, another earth, because the ozone is buses and it hit another earth and it got bigger.
Okay.
So then when that time survive in the west side, like Bowl, he's right here survive. And they come back and then right in the Grand Canyon, north side, it's like Grand Canyon. We come back in the water. Then when they break the mountain and then become Grand Canyon. So everybody's going to see what Grand Canyon.
These are
So,
our creation stories talking about first world, the dark world, and how we became
so this
surface
is
people.
all
here.
connection, everything. Here we educate ourselves, but here the government make more law. They think they own us. Really control what our mother put on this world. Then we go. How do we grow? Somebody left the sandwich here. it'd be rotten. Because all this air and nature and with us, you will grow. Like rain, even the plants the same way we are. We educate ourselves just for purpose. Sure, it's nice too for a while.
But getting back to this basket, I want to explain that, there's a lot of historical context that he's referring to, like earth changes and things that in our remembrance, of where we came into this world, the emergence, when the water subsided. It's always interesting today because, cultural anthropologists say, oh, Navajos, they migrated from the Bering Strait. But our history, we talk about the Nanahatloni, the people that still exist. And a lot of these stories aren't written or documented in books. And this is our what you would hear from our elders when they talk about the ceremonies and the emergence and why our people had to leave and what led up to those changes, the earth changes. They say that we have impacted and affected this earth in the past and things became very dangerous. And that's, why we come back to this basket and that kind of original, covenant that was made with the holy ones. These are the ceremonies, the prayers. You use that, in order to work with our natural world. Tornadoes and certain things are coming back into our region because we're losing a lot of our ceremonies, and the windway ceremonies or certain things aren't being practiced or acknowledged at certain times. So a lot of these things, our elders would tell you there's taboos, don't dig in the earth, you're going to affect the earth because this happened in the past, and once the earth is out of balance, it's like how people talk about climate change or the imbalances of the world today. These are things that our elders, they recognize and they say, we've done that before, and that's why they say everything has to be maintained a certain way, even your hair. Don't cut your hair because it's connected with the universe, with the atmosphere. Everything that we work with, our body is a direct reflection of this earth. And if we alter or change or impact our body, this earth is viewed as a living female entity, just the same as our body. Our grandmother from Black Mesa, Roberta Blackgoat, she traveled to the UN to protect our people against mining operations that occurred in our territory from Peabody coal. And she'd always explain that the coal, that's the liver of the earth, and that's a functioning organ. And it's the same is true, like when you think about, the water and how the best water, it goes through coal filtration, and you've got these beautiful aquifers. Some of the best water, comes from those regions where there is coal because it is a filtration system, and it acts just the same in our body. So these are the teachings that our elders would explain, is that everything, physical about us, this is, our hair, this is a symbol of the rain or a forest and all those things, and how to keep that balance intact.
And the teachings are embedded in the construction of the basket, the narratives, as well as the ceremony and the dance that accompanies it. And I'm getting back to what you were explaining earlier. You were growing up with tradition all around you. It wasn't something special you paid attention to outside of daily life. It was embedded in how you were educated and then how you're trying to carry on.
A lot of people, when they see our dances or hear our songs, they think of an art form. But for us, it's not so much that it's an art form, but it's a part of daily living practice that is a connection with our traditional sciences and what some of us still utilize, and we hope that more people will in the future, that our younger generations will learn.
Well, I want to thank you for doing this interview, but also ask one more question. Is there anything else that we need to know? Well, people watching this video in 20 years, what would they need to know? What have we left out of our conversation?
I would like to remind people that when you touch your heart and you feel your heartbeat, that goes all the way back to the beginning of time. Your heart beats because you grew within your mother's womb when her heart was beating, going all the way back. And so many times people think that we are disconnected from our ancestors, when in fact we're not. This heart that's beating is because of them. That continuous heartbeat that's been passed on from generation to generation. And even with our breath, everything that we are is because of our ancestors, because of the sciences that they had honed, that they utilized, that we're here because of them. And our future generations, when we look at what our culture is today, we have to look at our future generations of what is it that we want to teach them.
Everything is transforming so quickly. I know with a lot of our ceremonies, even the style of dress, when we do hoop dance, for example, there's contests today, and people are always trying to make things more flashy, more brighter, faster. But the true origin of a lot of those dances, it's very simple. Somebody might refer to this as an outfit, but this is the style of clothing. This is what, how people would wear their clothes. Even, I know when my dad, would make his own buckskin shirts, that's because he learned from his grandfathers. That's how they used to tan. Even with the jewelry, when they used to go out and, he talks about seeing his grandfather collect silver or materials, raw materials, and then, smash it up, forge it and pour silver. And they talk about, this is something that's older than the Spanish, he says, from Mayan and Aztec and, even the interconnection between all these tribes. We have a clan system that's in place. We call it K'e. With the Navajo clan system, it identifies where each tribe, each nation, where they come from. We have four main clans, but from there it branched out. And even today it's transforming and encompassing so many other nations, and new clans are being added. My daughter, she comes from Besh Bachaha, because her mother is, recognized as the Iron Hat people, the ones known as German. And we're adaptive, our way of life, and it's going to keep changing, it's going to keep progressing, but understanding, the origins and how, what we carry on, what our Father has guided us with, is these are the traditional forms. This is what, he learned before first contact in our region, and that's still intact. Understanding that each warrior hat, a tzak b'chat, that these, there's a society, there's a way to initiate, and all those details, we're holding on to it by a thread today, and how to preserve that, that's what we're looking for, answers and solutions. And there are documentations and things that are preserved here at the Library of Congress, and how to make that accessible and connect that with our communities back home on the reservation. That's the key. That if there's information here that's preserved here, or maybe in Europe or other places throughout the world, how do we ensure that makes its full circle and back to our people? That's what's going to ensure the survival, of this potentially this interview, this, what the words that our Father has shared, and it's just ensuring that it connects to the next generation, just as it is oral. That maybe one day a child from our nation might hear, this, maybe my dad might be recognized as their great-great-grandfather or something of that nature. It's beautiful to just be here and to pause for a moment and think of it in that way, that we're not just sharing it just for you. This is for a child that might be wanting to learn more about, what does this basket mean, or what's the symbolism of this? So very honored to think of it in that way.
And I think it would be appropriate to say, our clans as well, because you know, that's how we introduce ourselves, and that's how we know how people are related to us. And so, Dida Esha Ja'a, this is my father. Dida Esha Tsila, this is my little brother, or my younger brother. Our language is very descriptive. Yat Esha E Jeneda Benally Yanishya. My name is Jeneda Benally. Shema E Be'etlichi'i, Ado Shaja'a E Dene. Anani Twadichini Bashichin, Ado Nakai Dene Dashanilla. Polish Hoyegi Dashiche, Ado Zitlijin de Nasha. Kintlana E Shehoan Alto. So I've introduced myself and my clans so that way one day in the future, you know, when our great-great-great-grandchildren, you know, can hopefully hear and they'll understand that we're related to them. And we've carried on all of this tradition just for them.
Well, I do want to thank you all for participating in this, Jones, Jeneda, and Clayson. So thank you very much for the performance and for the conversation.
I got to introduce myself.
Yes.
I'm Jones Benally. Jones Benally, das ist eine Aroe, ja, Todets ini, Slick Anani, Todets ini, Satane, Aroe, das ist sie, sehr, da hatte Nakhaitene, Sastane, out nen slid only, Ade, Kayate, Queni, Kaiti, Kote, Washington, the Hoda Kiltahilne, Kodoyat, ne, Nijit, Adole, Badahuinit, Ido, Adole, Betaho Ahi, Dibili, Hot out Adole, a Shinde Kahodat, Ego, Koti, Kote, Washington, the Kodo, Kiltahilne, Kodos, Kota, Adahois Ago, Yat, Eko, Kedasli, Doda also, Koyat, Eko, Kedahuiti, Eke.
Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you, every one of you, and then it's more important to work together, especially here in this country, our headquarters. We need work together, need peace. We don't want disturbing anything. We want to live good life, our life, our grandkids, and the animals, everything. We need to take care of ourselves and for the others, everybody. We all educate ourselves and we have problems the same level, but we pray for ourselves, a better way of life. Do you think so?
I think so. I'm in agreement. Well, thank you all very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.